Buenos días. Buenos días. Vamos a empezar ya el acto de este 23º Memorial Dr. Lino Torre. En primer lugar, quiero disculpar a nuestra gerente, la doctora Olga Pané, que finalmente no podrá acompañarnos. Y sobre todo, agradecerles su presencia y que hayan podido dedicar un tiempo para estar con nosotros en este Memorial Lino Torre, que es un día muy especial para nuestro servicio de cirugía, probablemente desde un punto de vista académico, el día más importante para el servicio de cirugía durante el año y también para nuestro hospital. Y prueba de ello es que este Memorial Lino Torre se lleva celebrando de forma consecutiva durante 23 años. Y además, el año pasado tuvimos que hacerlo de forma virtual y este año por fin nos podemos volver a encontrar en esta sala, aunque también lo retransmitimos por YouTube y también estará disponible posteriormente en esa plataforma. Celebramos este memorial en honor del doctor Lino Torre, quien fue jefe de servicio de cirugía del Hospital del Mar desde 1966 hasta el año 1986. Durante esos 20 años, el doctor Lino Torre supo transmitir a sus discípulos y colaboradores no solamente su excelente técnica quirúrgica, sino también su espíritu crítico, su tenacidad, su inagotable capacidad de trabajo y su sentido clínico. Desde el punto de vista de la docencia, impulsó un modelo de formación de residentes puntero en nuestro país y fue uno de los pilares a la hora de crear la unidad docente en nuestro hospital. Asimismo, dedicó una gran parte de su tiempo a la investigación y puso en marcha líneas que hoy todavía persisten. A lo largo de su carrera, el doctor Lino Torre recibió múltiples premios, pero quiero destacar especialmente el premio Virgili que recibió en el año 1993, otorgado por la Sociedad Catalana de Cirugía. Este memorial pretende mantener su recuerdo no solo para los que le conocieron y tuvieron la oportunidad de trabajar con él, sino también para las siguientes generaciones de cirujanos. La estructura de este memorial será la misma que en años anteriores. Tenemos una conferencia de un ponente invitado que presentaré a continuación y después la entrega de 3 premios. Clásicamente, el premio Lino Torre es el premio al mejor trabajo de investigación quirúrgica por un equipo de cirujanos de España y así lo hemos entregado ya durante 21 años. Añadimos hace pocos años el premio al mejor residente del servicio de cirugía que entregaremos después y también el año pasado entregamos por primera vez el premio Ignasi Poves al mejor docente del servicio de cirugía general de nuestro hospital. El doctor Ignasi Poves se incorporó a nuestro servicio de cirugía en el año 2006 y en los años posteriores consiguió desarrollar a un nivel técnico difícilmente imaginable unos años antes la cirugía hepática y pancreática de alta complejidad mediante abordaje mínimamente invasivo. Gracias a su trabajo, posicionó nuestra unidad de cirugía hepática y pancreática en primera línea a nivel internacional. Pero además de una gran habilidad técnica y una extrema dedicación y cuidado a sus pacientes, queremos destacar su gran interés por la formación de residentes y de otros especialistas. Por ese motivo, este año entregaremos por segundo año consecutivo, y así lo hemos instaurado para el futuro, el premio Ignasi Poves al mejor docente de cirugía general. Y ahora sí que paso a presentarles a nuestro ponente invitado, que es el profesor Des Winter. Professor Des Winter is consultant surgeon at St. Vincent's Hospital in Dublin and clinical professor of surgery at the University College in Dublin as well. He trained in Dublin and also at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, among also other institutions. I can say with no doubt that he is a world leader in colorectal surgery. I haven't had the opportunity to operate with him, but I know very well that he's a very skillful surgeon from minimally invasive surgery that he has always defended from the early days to the more radical pelvic surgery for locally advanced rectal cancer and recurrences. He's also a superb teacher, and proof of that is the large number of fellows from all over the world that has trained with him, some of them in this room. And he's also a leader in research with a large number of publications in the best journal. In fact, he's the editor-in-chief of one of the best journals in the world, the BJS, the British Journal of Surgery. I've had the opportunity of working with him for the last year within the executive committee of the ESCP, the European Society of Coloproctology, and what I admire most of him is his great capacity of work and his brilliant mind. But beyond that, he's a friendly and humble person. And our residents had yesterday the opportunity to meet him, to have a dinner with him, and chat with him, and I'm sure that they can confirm that. Thank you so much for having accepted our invitation to be our guest speaker today in our 23 Memorial Lino Torre.
Oh, thank you so much, Miguel. It's fabulous to see you all here. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've been to Barcelona before, but never for very long. So this is the longest time I've ever been here, and it's always a pleasure to visit. Fabulous city. I think you have the best rooftops in the world. There are many beautiful cities in the world, but nowhere else has rooftops done as beautifully as here. And it shows you a kind of a mindset and an attention to detail that's both architectural but also artistic and have a lovely flair. So it shows you, I think, that you think of yourselves not only from the bottom but also to the top and beyond. And that's just before we get into the art and the surgical science and history and everything that comes from here. What a beautiful hospital. I don't think I'd ever leave if I came to work here. I think I'd probably sleep on the roof looking out at sea. It looks fantastic. So you are blessed, all of you, to be working here. I've been asked to talk about surgery in the post-COVID era. Of course, we're not quite post-COVID. We're probably still in the midst of COVID, unfortunately. I've just received a phone call that my operating list next week will be decimated of anything that isn't malignant disease, for example. So it was pertinent. Now we're here, of course, not really to talk about me, but to talk about Lino Torre. His real name is fantastically, I'm sorry it doesn't project very well up there, but Elezegui, which Elezegui is at the end. Born in Santiago de Compostela, 1923, and lived until, unfortunately, died in 1998. You can see some photographs here that you can get very easily from the websites. I thought it fascinating to see him as a young man. That's about 1946, 47, 48 sometime, not long, of course, after the war. And then here he is later on in the 1960s, I think it is. And then, of course, here a little closer to when he died tragically, only at the age of 75. And I've left this here in your own language for you to be able to read, just the little snippet that you get from the website. But it shows how human and how well he was thought of. And this, of course, is the mindset of the institution comes from people like that. And if you look at what the future of your institution is going to look like in a number of years, I think it must be the most beautiful hospital in the world, easily. This is a picture taken from part of the coastal Ireland. It was when someone actually captured lightning striking, and lightning has been known to strike at this place twice. This is the second time actually captured on camera, so this proves beyond all reasonable doubt that lightning does actually strike twice at the same site. And of course, this is not the first time we have seen pandemic and population decimation. If you look at actually collapse of population in Mexico, you had a number of them, a number of diseases, beginning with smallpox, which we as Europeans probably brought to Mexico in the first place. And you could see that there were millions and millions and millions of deaths, which reduced the population many times. Any of you who are familiar with the history of Britain and Ireland will know that there were many events, including famines, where we were unable to sustain ourselves. And the population at that time, when you go back to the 1800s, was bigger in Ireland than it was in England. Ireland was a more flourishing place than England was, but due to the complexity of what things went on, and at the time the Napoleonic Wars, the English sucked most of the energy out of Ireland. A lot of that went towards the war effort. A lot of the food went to feed them. And when you could not afford to live because you had to make make food to send away for money, then the local population retracted into eating potatoes. And potatoes are not endemic to Ireland, as you know, and indeed have a long history in this country and in Americas as a result, because you brought it over there too. So it's not just unique to Ireland, but it's a cheap, easy, simple thing to do with cheap land. Then when they had a potato blight, they had a difficulty because now they had to choose to send food to eat, or to send food for money, or to eat. So it was very difficult. So in essence, they were having to eat their own money, if you think of it like that. And all of that happened just after a volcano went off. Now, most of you won't have heard of it because there was a Mount Tamburo went off in the 1800s, before the days of cable. So nobody knew that this had happened in the world. But there was a huge ash cloud which changed the world's temperatures for 1 or 2 years. And there was, in most countries, a serious change in the atmosphere and a crop failure, which for a small country like Ireland was quite devastating. And that led to a typhus outbreak. And the typhus outbreak was one of the reasons why Irish people were not welcome in England, because of course they brought with them typhus fever. And it was very interesting to hear that the origins of this hospital were of a typhus hospital in 1914, I think it was, you said, which is roughly about 100 years after these events happened. Any of you who are students of art and you enjoy art, the famous English painter Turner, who did all of those warship things, or if you watch the Bond films for the young ones, the Bond films, often behind M, there is a picture of the old relic being towed away, which is meant to signify Bond, and all of this masculinity and all of this horrible misogyny is old and should be carried away. They're Turner pictures, and they all have a red sky, and that red sky was typical of what all painters painted in those days, because they thought that this was the end of the earth. The end of the world was coming. This was the apocalypse. And with apocalyptic thoughts came with it a number of things. For example, Percy Shelley had just lost his wife tragically in childbirth. He went to live with Byron, Lord Byron, on the lakes of Lake Geneva, and he went to live there, where he was introduced to Mary, and Mary became his wife later. She became Mary Shelley. And while they were there, they all thought about, this is the dawn of the earth. This is going to be the end of man's creation, Prometheus, everything like that. And Lord Byron challenged them to come up with something. And Mary Shelley went to her room every night and under candlelight wrote Frankenstein as a result. Never wrote much more. And of course, it wasn't called Frankenstein. It was called Prometheus, the Dawn of Man. So all of that came from these type of disasters and these type of problems that we have. If you look at the death toll, I had a quick look at Worldometer this morning. 250 million people have known to have COVID, and of those, 5 million have died. That is dwarf in comparison to what bubonic plague did. And remember, these are guess numbers because we didn't know the population, but millions died of bubonic plague, smallpox. The Spanish flu, we were discussing this last night with the residents. The Spanish flu, most people accept as the Spanish flu. Well, I went to ask, why is it called the Spanish flu? The Spanish flu at the time came just after the First World War. The English newspapers, the German newspapers, and I think also the Italian newspapers did not want to publish that there was yet another bad thing coming, because we had just emerged from this horrible, horrible time of a world war where millions and millions of people had been killed. So they didn't want to talk about it. But the English in particular, when it came about that the King of Spain became gravely ill with the flu, they published that this must be a Spanish phenomenon, and they called it a Spanish flu. So this was not done, this was done for nefarious means, in the same way that Trump in a modern world was calling this the Chinese bug, the Chinese disease, the Chinese flu. There's a blame culture in all of this, and yet pandemic is exactly as the name suggests, all around the world. The plague of Justinian in way back in 500 BC, probably wiped out 40 to 50 million people around the world, which at the time was a much, much, much higher proportion of the world. So we've seen this before. Now, the good news about things like the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, roughly when that wrong, was it changed the way people did things and disrupted the way people did things in a very positive way. It began the whole culture of credit, of being able to buy something that you will pay for over time or that you will pay for later. Advertising, electricity, new forms of energy, lighting, heating, industrialization, all of that, and convenient shopping. And you can see that exactly the same thing has happened now. Amazon and all of these online shopping have gone crazy through the skies. And with that, of course, are all of the things that go with it. Packaging. There's a large company in Ireland called Smurfit Packaging. They cannot keep up with the demand. It is not possible to do so. With that comes recycling. With that comes new energy. With that comes with ways of thinking of new packaging and what we can do with it. So it's not all bad news. But what's the sort of common thread between all of that? Well, things speed up in terms of technological advances, in terms of healthcare advances, and I'm going to touch on some of those today. But let's talk about trade, first of all. It's thought that diseases like this spread along ancient silk routes, as they're called. The silk routes that came from China through Afghanistan, through some of the Arab countries, and then into the rest of Europe. And that is, of course, historically, way back when, back in Viking times, back in 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, this is how diseases spread. But of course, that's not how things happened in a modern world. In a modern world, it is much more likely that it's airline traffic. And if you look at the events that unfolded, this was, sure, in China was the obvious epicenter, but it reached the west coast of America before it reached Europe. So this crossed the Pacific, then came from America as well as from China in both directions, which is possibly why we got hit so badly and of course the big centres which have the big airports were the ones that were most affected of all at first, number one, and number two, those who had a vulnerable population. And there are many cultural reasons for that, in addition to obviously presumably some genetic reasons for that, which most people don't want to mention, but it is likely that there will be some more susceptible than others in certain disease areas. Now, not a lot of people know this. I had a patient who said, way back in the beginning of the pandemic, he told me that this idea that it came from a wet market where they sell fish and heads and bats and things, he said that's really unlikely. I can tell you what there is in Wuhan. There is a coronavirus investigation center. There's an actual virus laboratory where they investigate. And not far from that area, they had the World Military Games. I said, what were the World Military Games? And he said, go look it up. So I did. The 7th World Military Games were held in Wuhan, China, October 18th, 2019. You had 10,000 athletes flew in. Now remember, there's 10,000 athletes. For every athlete, there's a trainer. For every trainer and athlete, there's also an individual who's either a partner or a loved one or a child. So there's at least 3 or 4 per that. So there's probably in the region of 50,000 people flew in from over 100 countries. And then locally, they recruited roughly 250,000 people just to support it, in addition to the 100,000. So you had almost 500,000 people congregating in a great big area in Wuhan in China in that time. I wasn't able to do this mostly because of my job as an editor of a journal, which makes me vulnerable to, unfortunately, to being sued, but also to bringing a journal into disrepute. So I didn't do this myself. So I got my daughter to do it, who's only 16, so she can't be sued. And I got her to just, to write this up as a sort of an interesting thing. And I'm sorry for the spelling mistake. It's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? The daughter of an editor, and it's Millery instead of military, but that's life. She's not going to be a doctor, I don't think. And that's good. That's a good thing. You can see if you plot the number of athletes per country, and then the number of cases in that country, and we did this last year, you can see that there is a direct correlation. Sure, there's a few outliers like Portugal. Portugal has an extreme outlier in terms of the penetration of that population. You have a better idea than I do why that would be, but a lot of it has to do with congregating, not obeying rules, not wishing to wear masks, not locking down, etc., and super families coming together at weekends for meals and things. But you can see that it is highly significant. If you look at that from a significant point of view, there is less than 10 or even 100,000 chance that it is not related to that in terms of the infectivity at the time. And she was able to come up with a very simple, mathematical equation whereby you can determine the number of predicted cases if X is a country-specific quotient. For Portugal 17, for Spain 1.7. The Y is the number of athletes per country, or in this case, if one of you flew to another country and came back with COVID, what would happen? Well, one person multiplied by 4, because that's how many people you infect, that's 4 squared, that's 16, and the country-specific code 1.7. So 16 roughly comes around about 32. So if I go back to Ireland with COVID, it is likely 32 people would become infected as a result of that. It's not forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So that's roughly the number. What are we talking about? We're talking about it just to refresh our memory. SARS refers to this coronavirus. It's an RNA virus rather than a DNA virus, and it is quite small. Its median size is about 120 nanometers. When you realize that, you realize what we're asking people to do. Wearing masks helps, but it doesn't eliminate the virus from exposure. The only way to really identify it properly is with reversed transcriptase PCR, which I've spelt out here for those of you who aren't scientific, because I'm aware we have some relations and things with people. In essence, what has to happen is that we convert that RNA, which is a virus or even plant type of DNA, we have to convert that into DNA, translated, and then amplify it. When you do all of those steps, one of the difficulties with this is false positives and false negatives. In fact, when I was doing research, we called PCR persistent cellular remnants, and this was the challenge, that actually, if I leave little bits of DNA here on the stage, am I here still if you test in a day or two? No. So the presence of DNA does not actually mean that it's actually there at the time. It just means that it has passed through, or that it has passed through that test machine. So there are difficulties. Antibodies, as you know, aren't great because they lag behind markers, so they're not good for acute infection, but they can at least give you an indication that you have had exposure at some point. Minimum dose, we do not know, because it really hasn't happened where we've taken large populations of volunteers to give to them a dose of coronavirus to find out what's the minimum infective dose, or the 50% dose. How much does it take to infect 50%? We know from models with mice that it only takes a few hundred virions to do it. So it's not a lot. And we do know from that the R rate, the R0 rate, is roughly 3. So each person infected will infect directly 3 people almost immediately or within a short space of time. This varies, of course. 18 particles is all it takes. If any of you have seen norovirus, the so-called winter vomiting bug, if you get that on a ward, it spreads right through the ward very quickly, particularly through the elderly and the infirm. This is not quite as virulent as that, so it probably takes more than 18 particles, but it is not that much more. I think it's kind of fascinating just to bear this in mind. If I cough across the room, 3,000 droplets at 50 miles an hour, it's extraordinary, isn't it? But a sneeze, and this is where the one that's really challenging, and this is where wearing a mask and covering oneself, particularly when sneezing, is important. 30,000 droplets, 200 miles an hour, and you can see, if any of you watched it on social media or anything else, if I were to sneeze, the particles almost hit the wall. It's quite an extraordinary distance that goes across with a sneeze. And if you know that that 50 to 500 droplets, it comes out with just one single breath, and roughly, therefore, you're producing somewhere in the region of 10 or 20 virus RNA copies per minute, just breathing alone. Imagine what's in a sneeze, and you can see just how effective that is. And that's the point about wearing masks, of course, is that it contains those sprays that come out. Do we know if it can live in aerosols? The answer is we do not. All of the modelling that has been done to date has been done precisely like that in models, and therefore we're not quite sure. If you remember, in the beginning days of the pandemic, we were concerned about what would be in surgical smoke and what would be in atmospheres in the hospitals, and all we could do as journalists was try to publish as quickly as we could the best guidelines that we could get out there, which was simply to wear a face mask, to wear protection, and in particular if you're in high-risk areas or aerosol-producing procedures, to wear all of the full personal protective equipment that we did. And of course we went to extreme measures such that we were operating practically wearing hazard suits in the early days, and it was terrifying going down to the emergency room and having everyone dressed in yellow hazmat suits. It looked like Ebola virus had hit the place. And it was frightening because for all of us, we just did not know, wasn't it? And perhaps the hardest part of this as clinicians, of course, has been the psychological trauma. Because while everyone else was scared, we had to be scared but keep working. So make no mistake, the last 2 years for all of us, and that's just as bad as it is for the old people as it is for the young people. For the old people, they've lost time. For the young people, you've lost time. For the young people, you're maybe more elastic. For the old people, this is terrifying too, and they have also a more greater sense of personal danger than you do when you are young. So the trauma of this is exactly the same trauma as you get in wartime, and the post-traumatic stress issues are exactly the same. And if you all do a little self-examination, I doubt any of you, as tough as you think you are, have not suffered in some way psychologically over the last couple of years. In particular, loss of loved ones, going to work, wearing masks, not doing the usual social contact. It's been hard. And that's perhaps the greatest challenge for all of us to get past. We know that the virus is capable of existing in some forms of smoke and some forms of smoke particles. But what we do not know is that whether or not that there is evidence of that there is actually transmission as a result. Now, what we do know is that you can get HPV, human papillomavirus, direct transmission from burning off warts. And when we were young people, young surgeons, we were sent in to burn off warts off the people's perineal area. We wore no masks, we wore nothing. We just burned them off. And inevitably, some of that smoke would have been inhaled by almost everyone in the room. We have been able to identify that you can identify the same DNA signature in cancers of the nasopharynx than came from the HPV virus in the beginning. So there's direct evidence that you can inhale it and that can cause cancer. So we also know that you can get HIV, hepatitis B, etc., in that kind of surgical smoke. We just have never identified has anyone actually been had a transmission of that. So we've got to be careful about that. We don't know whether any energy devices that are any better or worse than others. It is likely that those who have coated blades, feedback voltage reduction may reduce the risk of smoke. And of course, you can't assume that laser or ultrasonic shears produce less problems. In fact, actually, there's some evidence they may actually present more problems than others. So we've got to be careful with that. So how we deal with aerosols has actually been one of those waterfall events that I was talking about. This is a new thing that we're going to think about. And your future, your young surgeons, your future will be a much cleaner air future than our future was. Thank God. So we just pause for a moment at this point to see what have we got? What little predictions for the future for this is purely from my perspective only, and each of you will have a different perspective on this reality. I think preoperative testing for multiple viruses will become routine. So nowadays it's routine for testing for COVID with a PCR test done very, very quickly preoperatively. I think it is only a small step to say, well, why don't we test patients for HIV, for hepatitis C, for other transmissible viruses as a panel test when we're doing PCR? Because when you're doing PCR, it's just as quick and easy to do a panel test like that. And I think that's going to become a routine thing because it is going to become unacceptable that a patient could infect you or could infect someone else or could affect your anesthesiologist or could affect one of the nurses on the ward. Negative pressure ventilation operating room environments, I suspect you have probably routinely in lovely, swanky, cool buildings like this. But most hospitals in the world do not have that on a routine basis. So that's going to become much more routine, and that's a good thing. Things like electrostatic aerosol precipitation devices, we installed immediately. I got them installed in every operating room. There's a particularly good one that came out of Cardiff in Wales, and that's done by the same people who did Mowbray et al. in BJS. It's that same group. They worked with a university building research centre, much like that lovely one that you have here, and they produced, in essence, a very simple thing. It ionizes the air. It has an anode and a cathode. The cathode's already on the patient, the diathermy plate. It ionizes with a very small electrostatic charge, therefore smoke particles fall to the bottom and stay in the patient. And it's a very simple way of reducing smoke particles. Filtration systems, circulating insufflation, containing emissions, all of that's going to be a good thing. It'll be to try to prevent us getting virus infected, but think about the good effect. When we do laparoscopic cholecystectomy, we might use 10 litres of CO2. When we do a laparoscopic colectomy or a bigger operation like that, we might use 100 litres of CO2. Now, interestingly, when I was a young surgeon, I could not understand that CO2 we just released into the atmosphere. Nothing. We did nothing with it. Just everyone, and I used to ask, what's going to happen with that? And they said, it doesn't matter. And I said, well, sure it matters to something or someone out there. It can't be a good thing. At the top of the table, at the anaesthetist, had a box of calcium carbonate, and their circuit went through that. And I said, what's that for? And they said, that's to trap CO2. And I said, why do you do that and we don't? And no one to this day can still answer that question for me. The consequences of the CO2 that we release in a hospital setting, and that's just the CO2 alone, is an easy win. The harder wins are preventing packaging, plastics, all of the drinks, the coffee, when we throw things away. They're harder yards, but the easy yard is to contain the CO2 that comes out and is exposed like that. And I think that's one of the examples of technological advances that's going to be really quick, and here very, very, very quick, very fast. Now, the consequences, I talked a little bit about the waves that we talk about, the waves of a pandemic. The media misunderstand these waves, unfortunately, because they think each is another wave, meaning another dose or another group of people who are infected. That's not the way to think of it. If you look at Worldometer and click it onto logarithmic, you will see that in Spain, your mortality is very stable now. You have done a great job. It was awful in the beginning, but it's a great job now of maintaining that. The awful countries, the bad countries who haven't taken up a vaccine, are continuing on a logarithmic scale in terms of their death rates. But the waves that we talk about are actually not just deaths and not just infections, but also economic, and also the other challenging and problems and difficulties that you see as a result. In particular, one of them, if you just look at vascular surgery, for example, vascular surgery, because it wasn't considered to be life-threatening, it wasn't considered to be immediately apparent, is so far behind that they will never catch up. There's quite a good group, the COVID Surge Collaborative, who published at BJS last year the consequences of what's happened. They went to 190 countries around the world. Most of them were high and middle-income countries, and some were in the region of 300 million operations have not been performed now as a result of the pandemic. And even if we were to increase by 20%, which you think maybe if you were a lay person, increasing productivity by 20% is easy. But how do you do that when you're already working 5 days? So even if you did a full day on Saturday, and many hospitals already do operate on a Saturday, but even if you did on a Saturday, it would take 44 weeks to catch up from what we are missing. And that was at the time of that publication, and we are now several months later. So we are now behind in terms of elective non-cancer work. So far, it will take more than a year. And the consequences, the challenges, the problems that come as a result of that are going to be immense. And I'm sure you're all seeing that. People are coming in as emergencies instead of having elective operations, and it puts a load more pressure on a system. That's before we get into the other challenges, which are training. If you think about what training is lost in a 5-year residency in Spain, 2 out of 5 years have just been taken out. Awful. It may stretch to 2.5 to 3 years in total, which means that the majority of some people's residency has been reduced in terms of their exposure, in terms of what it is that they grew up with, because these are not normal times. So for those of you who are residents, don't worry, there's more to come. And your training is a continuum. It's not a defined package. It is like light. You think of it as a package, but it is actually a continuous stream. And the real learning, really begins when you are finished your training. And that's when the real adrenaline kicks in and the real learning actually starts. What your training years do is to give you the mental capacity, the psychological capacity, if you like, to cope with the challenges of the future. And no other residency in recent history has had this much stress, this much pressure placed on you at such a young age in such a short space of time. So actually you're better trained, not worse trained. You just have had less exposure to surgery, which you'll have the rest of your lives. So there's a positive spin on it. This is a good group, the COVID Surge Collaborative Group. This one in particular was published in The Lancet. And with large population cohort studies like this, you can identify the realities, which are, wow, if you have COVID at the time of surgery, you've got a 24% mortality risk. 1 in 4 die. Wow. 51% pulmonary complications. Huge. So now you know, don't operate on someone who's got COVID, who has active COVID. Your specific risk factors are all the ones that you would expect. Male, over 70, high ASA grade, with a cancer, with a debilitation in advance of surgery, requiring emergency surgery, and of course having major surgery. All of those major risk factors. So in essence, their summary guidelines are pretty specific. It's what you'd expect. Vaccinate, consider the timing of surgery, make sure everyone's tested, make sure your infrastructure is correctly identified, make sure that the risk and consent is discussed with the patient. You can tell these are usually British people. They think an awful lot about consent. We aren't as bothered with that. I suspect you aren't either. To us, we allow a degree of intelligence to the patient where the patient understands they're having surgery, that surgery has inherent risks, but they wish to proceed with it. We don't waste time on consent forms much. We just sign here. It's really just to make sure that it's the correct you, the correct me, the correct operating theatre. Or as I often joke, you know, that you don't end up having, you know, your teeth taken out instead of whatever it is I was meant to do. And they're the key messages that they have for them. It's all very straightforward, I think. And consider high-risk patients actually deferring that intervention or providing opposite opportunities for them. Indeed, during the pandemic in the early days, in some countries, they stopped operating on cancer and gave lots of radiotherapy and chemotherapy instead. Have a think about that. Have a think about the implications of that for the future. Now, we got together a commission on surgery and perioperative care post-COVID-19. We put all of these authors together. I've forgotten how many there were. I think there's 1,000 in this BGS Commission team. We invited from all over the world, from Europe, South America, China, everywhere, people to give perspectives, anything, whatever interesting things that they had to do. And in particular, I think this is the one that's most interesting for this audience. This is the Young BGS. These are the people who've signed up to be part of Young BGS. And you can see there is literally every country in the world has signed up to be part of that. It's free to join. You're welcome to do so. And what we will be doing in the future is delivering to you free educational content. We're not expecting anything in return. This is done for free. It is the community that we're trying to build in terms of an educational future rather than any monetary interest whatsoever. And all of the respondents from all of that gave us a number of things. Of course, they were disappointed with their training challenges, but these were the main questions. I think some of that projects reasonably well. Like I said, can it be aerosolized and can you be infected from COVID as a result of that? What's the best way of preventing these measures? What's the best way of stopping? Electrical, cautery, etc., laparoscopy, all of those dominated people's mindsets as to what we can do. And the simple answer is we do not know. But in doing this, we are setting it up out there saying these are research goals. If we were able to do so, we could even put some money behind that in terms of putting up, and that's something I am discussing with the BGS Society who own the journal, because they have reasonably deep pockets, and I'm saying, why don't we invite opportunities for people to define how they would do studies, and that we would actually grant it if they completed that study. So that's hopefully coming down the line. Now we're drawing to an end, you'll be grateful to hear. I think the molecular age, we talked about a molecular age for the last 21 years. I've been listening to people talking about a molecular surgery, molecular, isn't it so exciting, a molecular medicine, a personalized medicine. Nah, none of that was terribly personalized. Sure, we were edging closer to be able to define cancer populations with certain gene mutations or certain tumor mutations which were going to respond to a drug or not, but we haven't really got to a point of it being personalized care. This is now a game changer, because in advance of this, all of those companies who rapidly produced vaccines were already working on things like mRNA vaccination. This was not a new thing. They just had no ability to rapidly put it out there into a large group population like this. So we have now become the guinea pigs for a test which has worked out and worked out really well. Thank God. All of us went for it and said, sure, vaccinate me, it's better than the alternative. And there have not been huge major consequences against it. So now you can see the possibility of what you can do, because if you think about how clever that is, that you can take any type of synthetic mRNA, inject it into somebody, that will hit their ribosomes. Those ribosomes will produce any protein that you desire, in particular the proteins that they are missing. So now think about people who have mismatch repair proteins in Lynch syndrome, cancer syndromes in families, where you could vaccinate someone from birth and eliminate the disease, or at least hugely reduce the consequences of that disease. What about all of those other people who have gene deletions? In my country, cystic fibrosis is very big. It's almost endemic, if you like, even though it is a disease which is recessive. You would not expect it to be so, but that's just life. And in a small country, you inevitably have a degree of breeding overlap, as I like to say, or what most people call inbreeding. It is inevitable. Hemochromatosis, I was talking about last night with Miguel. I was saying that it's very common in the Irish population. It's a throwback to Viking times. These are all easy, simple diseases. But what about sepsis? There are some of you in the audience, if we got infected tomorrow with tonsillitis, some of you in the past, before antibiotics, would have got rheumatic fever. Other people not. Why is that? Some people more susceptible than others. These are all things which are correctable now, easily. So cancer care, genetic disorders, sepsis, I predict. And also think about transplantation. One of the problems and challenges we've had has been in getting patients. We injected islet transplants into patients in order to get them to improve their diabetes. And for 20 years, we have failed miserably in actually managing to get that happen. What if we were able to switch on or switch off things through a simple mRNA vaccine? Now that is now safe. And now the world would say, oh yeah, you mean like the COVID vaccine? Oh, okay, yeah. And they'll roll their sleeve up and say, well, go ahead, shoot me. So I predict this will be a watershed moment. This will be a huge change in terms of the technological advances of that entire field. And I think that that's really exciting. Now, from the positive to the perhaps not so positive, I think the biggest problem with this current pandemic has not been the death rate, because the projected death rate over background death rate, at least for my country, which is one I know specifically, is very small. How you should measure a pandemic is the excess mortality. So for my country, 30,000 people a year die. So if 32,000 died last year, it's only 2,000 more than you would have expected. So the actual cost to society, the cost is about 2,000 deaths. And when you drill into that, the vast majority of those were in a particular phase of life when death was kind of on its way. It was imminent anyway. So it's always sad, it's always tragic. I knew the first three of the first 6 people who died. I know them, this is personal for me. But death was coming for them anyway. But what's the real consequences? Well, I talked about training earlier on, I talked about that, but the economic consequences inevitably. Now, those of you remember the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, from 2021, the world went crazy. It went bananas. All of the money that it stored went crazy, the parties, and that became the Roaring Twenties. During that Roaring Twenties, when all of that money was spent, which delayed, bang, the crash. The depression that happened thereafter, later on in the 1920s. And one would predict that the biggest problem with this is going to be economically fiscal rather than actually medical. If you look at the vulnerability scores, this came out of The Economist, these were OECD countries' vulnerability, and they tested around about April 2020. You can see that Greece and Spain and Italy, Ireland would be up there. We're just a small country, they didn't list it up there, but we'd be up there for the same reason. Many of the population cannot do jobs from home in its entirety. We have lots and lots and lots of people in the retail and hospitality industry, and you have a lot of tourism, and you're requiring on that rather than doing other things. And therefore, the challenge for all of those countries, and that includes, as you can see, France, is a big one, much, much bigger one than other countries, for example, like Germany, which are industrial and do a lot of export, even Britain. So that the challenging economic times have yet to come, and are probably going to hit a year or two down from now. So we've all got to watch out for that. Now, some happy thoughts. When it seems the world is ending, remember who you are and what you do, or what we do, for surgeons. So this is, I like to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, okay? All we can do is our best as doctors, and surgeons, we always do, don't we? Be kind to one another. That's important. That's been particularly important during the tetchy, difficult times in the last couple of years. And remember, it's the patient, always. Consider the safety of the patient, but also consider the safety of your surrounding staff, especially now, and particularly now that you think a pandemic is waning. It's not. It's still raging out there. You're okay in Spain, but it's difficult out there for other countries too. Demonstrate some team leadership. Good practice starts with you, yourself. Educate the patient and their relatives, of course, and take time to reassure them. This is terrifying, much more so for them than it is even for you. Fear is our most personal and indulgent fantasy, isn't it? So don't presume. Don't presume that people know, and don't presume that people don't have it. Assume actually better that everybody is afraid of something. Great surgeons know when to operate. They also know when to ask for help. You all think as residents that surgeons that you're looking up to never need help, that they know how to do everything at any stage. First thing I'll ever do in this operating, when things are getting difficult or there's a problem, I will ask who's next door. I don't care who it is. Get him in here, give me a hand. As much help as possible is good. The more experienced hands, the better. It's all good for you. However bad times these times seem to you, don't worry, they're going to pass too. So there's no point in worrying. Just don't worry about these times. Worry about each other. Look after one another. That's actually the important bit. Look after your psychological health. I am are the most important letters in family. Be there for them too. The years when we all lie on our deathbeds, I guarantee you none of us will ever say, I wish I spent more time at work. Knowledge, finally, is no substitute for kindness. You can teach people, you can operate on people, you can give them medication, you can give them drugs, you can cure them, you can heal them, you can make them all of those things. But that's actually not what counts. What counts as a human, just as much as it does as a doctor, as a surgeon, anything else, is how you treat other people, because that's what they'll remember, how you make them feel about themselves and about you and about their environment. That's what people remember, much more than anything else. I always say to the residents, when the patients leave, I guarantee you they will remember three things only. They will remember how you made them feel, how you appeared, looked, sounded, and spoke. All of that, all at once. How you behaved, in other words. And finally, they'll remember one or two parts of what it is that you spoke to them, and most of the time they'll get it slightly wrong. So the only part that you can control is how you are to them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Winter, for such a fantastic talk. You have driven us in a fantastic journey from the early days in Wuhan to the future of surgery and those wise final advices. So thank you very much. Continuaremos ahora con la entrega de los premios. Y en primer lugar entregaremos el premio al mejor residente del pasado curso académico. La valoración la hacen el equipo docente, los tutores y el director de docencia del servicio, fundamentalmente basada en las evaluaciones a lo largo del año y también en el examen al final del año de residencia. La entrega del premio la hará una de las tutoras, la doctora Sandra Alonso, y el premio este año al mejor residente es para el doctor Marc Pérez. Enhorabuena. En segundo lugar, entregaremos el premio Ignasi Poves al mejor docente del servicio de cirugía general. En este caso, la elección la hacen los propios residentes, lo cual tiene especial valor, y entregará el premio, como también lo hizo el año pasado, a Ana Coma. El premio este año es para la doctora Patricia Sánchez Velázquez. Y por último entregaremos el premio Lino Torre al mejor trabajo de investigación quirúrgica y voy a leer directamente el acta. Reunidos en Barcelona el 8 de noviembre de 2021 a las 9:30 horas, en el despacho del director médico asistencial, los asistentes, el doctor Manuel Pera, la doctora Marta Pascual, el doctor Luis Grande, miembros del comité constituido para valorar el premio Lino Torre, manifiestan que, en primer lugar, los miembros del tribunal quieren dejar constancia de la gran calidad de los trabajos presentados en esta convocatoria. Después de haberlos valorado y calificado de forma individual, resuelven conceder por unanimidad el 21º premio Lino Torre al trabajo titulado Two-Stage Thrombin Cutted Pull-Through Coloanal Anastomosis for Low Rectal Cancer, a Randomized Clinical Trial, publicado en la revista JAMA Surgery en noviembre del 2020 y de que es el primer autor firmante, el doctor Sebastiano Biondo, jefe de servicio de cirugía del Hospital de Bellvitge, en representación de un equipo formado por miembros del Thrombin BCN Study Group, liderado por el Servicio de Cirugía General y Digestiva del Hospital de Bellvitge. Las razones principales de esta decisión se centran en el impacto clínico de un estudio que demuestra que una anastomosis coloanal en 2 tiempos puede evitar un estoma derivativo tras una resección anterior baja de recto. El diseño del estudio en forma de ensayo clínico aleatorizado y la publicación en la mejor revista internacional de cirugía han sido factores determinantes en la elección frente a otros trabajos presentados en la presente convocatoria, todos ellos de gran calidad. Enhorabuena, doctor Biondo. Y como es habitual cada año, ahora el doctor Biondo nos hará una breve presentación de los resultados de su trabajo.
Buenos días, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias a la institución Hospital del Mar por concederme este premio, tan prestigioso premio. Es el segundo. El primero fue hace 19 años en este mismo sitio. Y han pasado muchos años y el estímulo sigue siendo enorme. Diría casi más que cuando era más joven. Esto indica que este premio es estimulante, confirma y ayuda y promueve lo que es la investigación clínica en nuestro medio como cirujanos, que es lo que más está a nuestro alcance. Y algo de que el Hospital del Mar, en el servicio de cirugía del Hospital del Mar, es un ejemplo a seguir en todo lo que es la calidad de la investigación clínica. Y aquí quiero felicitarlos porque es estimulante por el resto de hospitales y solo así podemos avanzar y tener mejores resultados para nuestros pacientes. Muchas gracias. Pasaré ahora brevemente a presentar el trabajo al que se ha concedido el premio. Okay. Si por una parte el cáncer de recto localizado en recto medio y alto está bien estandarizado desde el punto de vista quirúrgico, lo que es el cáncer de recto del tercio distal sigue siendo un tema, un argumento de controversias. Muchos cirujanos todavía consideran el cáncer de recto bajo que se tiene que tratar con una amputación abdominoperineal. Por otra parte, gracias a los avances tecnológicos y a los avances de los conocimientos de la biología del cáncer, se ha siempre, en los últimos años, más tendencia hacia una cirugía conservadora de esfínteres. Tenemos que tener en cuenta, con esta clasificación de la localización del cáncer, que estamos hablando de cáncer muy complejos desde el punto de vista quirúrgico y son tumores donde es muy importante el impacto de la experiencia del cirujano y también, evidentemente, de la agresividad del tumor. Son cirugías que se pueden asociar a un alto índice de deficiencia anastomótica. Estos son los aspectos más controvertidos. Y, por otra parte, entra muy en juego también relacionada tanto con las complicaciones como con el tumor y con la técnica, lo que es la recurrencia local. Por otra parte, los pacientes tratados con cirugía por el cáncer de recto bajo son pacientes que tienen, en la gran mayoría, para no decir el 100% de los pacientes, problemas funcionales que irán superando, mejorando a lo largo del tiempo. Se conocen bien las causas de deficiencia anastomótica, por lo menos se han estudiado mucho, y muchas de ellas pueden coexistir en estos pacientes en el momento de la cirugía. Por lo tanto, en los tumores de recto inferior del cáncer de recto inferior está indicada la cirugía asociarla con una ileostomía de protección. Desde hace años, contrariamente a lo que se va diciendo muchas veces y muchos cirujanos, la ileostomía sí que protege del fallo de sutura y además protege también de la gravedad de las consecuencias del fallo de sutura con menos índice de intervenciones necesarias, como se vio ya en este trabajo en el 2008. Y además se ha confirmado con estas recientes metaanálisis la importancia que tiene la ileostomía en estos pacientes. Pero las ileostomías no están exentes de complicaciones, tanto complicaciones relacionadas con el estoma en sí, en el postoperatorio, que es un 20%, o a lo largo del tiempo que el paciente tiene la ileostomía. Por otra parte, se ha visto algún estudio que casi un 20% de los pacientes pueden no ser revertidos, es decir, no se puede restablecer la continuidad intestinal. Como decía, la ileostomía tiene un alto índice de morbilidad, de complicaciones postoperatorias. Este es un estudio reciente que acaba de publicarse en el Techniques in Coloproctology, donde hemos visto que sobre más de 400 pacientes, el 37% presentaba complicación después del cierre de la ileostomía. Y estas eran unas causas relacionadas con las complicaciones, estas complicaciones previas a la cirugía de la ileostomía, en la primera intervención, pueden influir en las complicaciones post-cierre de ileostomía. Por lo tanto, nos preguntamos, para evitar, además de aquellas complicaciones que tiene la cirugía en sí del cáncer, ¿podemos evitar de hacer una ileostomía y, por lo tanto, evitar las complicaciones de la ileostomía? Esta pregunta se ha contestado con algún método publicado en varios trabajos, pero sin estar confirmado por una evidencia de alto nivel científico. Por ejemplo, hace unos años se publicó la posibilidad de hacer una ileostomía temporal percutánea poniendo una sonda de nutrición enteral a nivel del ilio terminal y quitándola después de un estricto control de la sutura anastomótica, quitarlo hacia el 9º día. Parece según estos autores, que pueda disminuir las complicaciones de la dehiscencia anastomótica. No hay todavía ningún estudio, después de esta serie retrospectiva, que confirme, corrobore estos resultados también esperanzadores. Por otra parte, hay otros estudios que parecen demostrar que la colocación de una sonda rectal por vía transanal, por encima de la sutura, podría mejorar también los resultados. Son estudios cuyos resultados habría que tomarlo con mucha precaución, ya que son estudios con pacientes muy heterogéneos, vienen siempre de la misma población del este asiático y no han sido corroborados en nuestro medio. Otra alternativa es la ghost ileostomy, que es la ileostomía fantasma, si se dice. Es una situación en que en los pacientes operados de cáncer pasamos un tutor y dejamos fijado a la pared abdominal el ilion y solamente delante de una situación donde se sospecha o se confirma dehiscencia anastomótica se puede realizar una ileostomía rápidamente. Evidentemente, esta técnica no previene la dehiscencia anastomótica. Por tanto, los autores en general lo aconsejan a aquellos pacientes que tienen un bajo riesgo de dehiscencia anastomótica para evitar la cirugía que se necesite en caso de dehiscencia. Y por último, aunque hay otros métodos como el refuerzo transanal, vamos a centrarnos en lo que es el tema de nuestro trabajo. Hace más de 60 años, 70, en los años 50, se describe una técnica en dos diferentes sitios del mundo, uno en Cleveland y otro en Brasil, por dos cirujanos diferentes. El estudio se publica en 1961. Es una técnica que se aplica en pacientes que tienen situaciones de recto muy compleja, como rectal cáncer, entonces no había anastomosis mecánica, pacientes con Hirschsprung o pacientes con megacolon por enfermedad de Chagas. En estos pacientes, para evitar una colostomía permanente, se hacía la resección del recto y después, en el mismo tiempo, se dejaba el colon a través del ano durante unos 10 días y después de 10 días se suturaba, se cortaba y se hacía la anastomosis colonal. Esta técnica se describió en aquellos años y se abandonó con la introducción de las anastomosis mecánicas y también por el aspecto poco cómodo que tenía para el paciente. La racionalidad sobre que se basaba esta técnica era que a nivel de la pelvis menor se formaban adherencias y podían evitar así, si había un fallo de sutura, que el contenido intestinal pasara libre dentro de la cavidad peritoneal. Se abandonó esta técnica y se volvió a reintroducir por un grupo francés en el año 2000. Se presentó un estudio con 35 pacientes con cáncer de recto, con tratamiento con quimioradioterapia preoperatoria y a los que se le realizaba este tipo de cirugía. Los resultados fueron muy alentadores, ya que no se observó dehiscencia de sutura y los resultados funcionales fueron buenos en el 60%, el 70% al año, a los 2 años respectivamente. Esto estimuló más grupos a presentar, pero no tantos, evidentemente, y unas cuantas publicaciones después corroboraron estos resultados. Nosotros empezamos ya en la década pasada con nuestra inicial experiencia, tanto de forma electiva como cirugía de rescate en pacientes con problemas agudos y crónicos después de una cirugía de cáncer de recto. Y recientemente otros grupos han empezado también a utilizarla, ya que han cambiado el tipo de sutura después de un cáncer de recto de la lateroterminal a la terminoterminal, porque la lateroterminal parece tener más complicaciones postoperatorias en cuanto a dehiscencia de sutura. El grupo del profesor Panís en Francia, en París, actualmente, cuando tienen que hacer una anastomosis coloanal manual, tiene como alternativa la intervención de turbulcutate o delayed coloanal anastomosis. Delante de esta falta de evidencia, pensamos realizar un estudio cuyo objetivo era ver si era posible realizar esta técnica en pacientes con cáncer de recto distal y tener resultados similares, por lo menos a la cirugía convencional, podemos llamar hasta entonces. Ese estudio se diseña un estudio prospectivo aleatorizado en 3 centros, 2 en Barcelona, Bellvitge y Valle d'Hebron, y un centro en Nápoles. El primary endpoint ha sido comparar la complicación postoperatoria a los 30 días de la última intervención, pero también, evidentemente, estudiaremos, y se están estudiando, los resultados a 3 años en cuanto a complicaciones, problemas funcionales y, evidentemente, resultados oncológicos. Es un estudio randomizado con 2 brazos paralelos y cuyos criterios de inclusión han sido, evidentemente, la edad hasta los 75 años por evitar el deterioro de la función anorrectal, con pacientes con una resección curativa a los que no se puede hacer una sutura mecánica y necesitan una anastomosis coloanal, y también las metástasis hepáticas resecables no fueron contraindicación, siempre y cuando se podía hacer de forma curativa. Pacientes con incontinencia fecal, con cirugía previa o con otra cirugía, otro cáncer de colon sincrónico, fueron excluidos, así como aquellos con alto riesgo de complicación anestésicas. Así que tenemos 2 grupos, el grupo con sutura colonal manual, ileostomía, el grupo turbul cutet con cirugía en 2 tiempos para la sutura sin ileostomía. Este es un dibujo de cómo el proceso. Esta es una anastomosis colonal clásica según Parks, 6-8 meses y cierre de ileostomía. Y la otra técnica es la protrusión del colon, 6-10 días, y la anastomosis colonal sin ileostomía. Necesitamos 46 pacientes por grupo para buscar una diferencia en las proporciones de las complicaciones, el 64,5% en el cáncer tratados con ileostomía, anastomosis colonal, el 34% en turbul QT. Aquí se añade, evidentemente, es una composición, una unión de las complicaciones de la ileostomía y de la primera cirugía. Esto es la inclusión de los pacientes, después de la exclusión de aquellos que, por ejemplo, en quirófano ya era el último momento en que se establecía qué tipo de cirugía, si se podía hacer mecánica, el paciente se excluía. En cuanto a resultados, hemos visto que no había diferencia entre los 2 grupos, siendo más altas las complicaciones a nivel de la anastomosis colonal con ileostomía, pero sin diferencia. Y tampoco hubo diferencia en lo que es la estancia, y sí diferencia en el tiempo de quirófano, que era más largo en la ileostomía más la técnica de anastomosis colonal clásica. En cuanto a la necesidad de una segunda intervención, como el cierre de ileostomía, hemos visto que en el grupo de los pacientes con anastomosis colonal más ileostomía, 7 pacientes no fueron revertidos. Se dejó la ileostomía, 2 porque rechazaron de ser operados, 2 por progresión de la enfermedad, 1 por mortalidad y otro porque necesitó una intervención de Hartmann por isquemia de postoperatoria del colon. En el grupo turbul QT, de momento, solo un paciente en los 30 días necesitó una ileostomía definitiva por una panisquemia colónica postoperatoria. En cuanto a la morbilidad postoperatoria, lo que hemos visto es que en el grupo de anastomosis colonal con ileostomía hubo casi un 24% de dehiscencia de sutura y 13% en el grupo turbul, sin diferencias estadísticas. Pero lo que quiero destacar es que cualquier absceso pélvico se consideró como dehiscencia anastomótica. De hecho, solamente 6 pacientes se evidenció el defecto y 4 pacientes en el grupo turbul QT sin diferencia. Además, ningún paciente, ninguno, necesitó cirugía por la deficiencia anastomótica. Solamente fueron abscesos pélvicos. Y al año la morbilidad es similar en cuanto a estenosis o reingreso por oclusión, incluso intervención. Y tampoco en el año al año, esto fue el editor de la revista que nos pidió los resultados al año, aunque el objetivo era los 3 años, pero para mantener, lo entendimos, para que se demostrara la seguridad de la técnica, no solamente en los 30 días, y no hay diferencia en cuanto a recidiva local o a recidiva a distancia, y tampoco a nivel funcional, aunque necesitamos más tiempo para demostrar que no hay diferencia. Y rápidamente, no, atrás. Los fallos de siempre. No va, así. Una vez movilizado el recto a nivel abdominal, por vía, en este caso por la laparoscopia, hacemos la transección por vía transanal. En este caso, buscando el espacio interesfinteriano, veis que aquí hay un error, a mistake here is submucosus. So, así dejamos y vamos a buscar el espacio correctamente a nivel interesfintérico y completamos toda la circunferencia. Se cierra con una bolsa de tabaco, push string, con prolene 2 ceros para evitar cualquier contaminación y también por seguridad oncológica, evidentemente. Y una vez realizado el cierre de la bolsa de tabaco, lo que hacemos es completar la disección por vía transanal. Aquí se puede observar ya dentro de poco la comunicación con la cavidad, aquí, abdominal, se completa y entonces se procede a la incisión de Pfannenstiel, ahora veremos. Aquí está la pieza, hacemos la sección por el Pfannenstiel. Nunca sacamos la pieza por vía transanal, salvo en tumores muy pequeños. Y esto nos sirve, es muy importante utilizar el colon, no el sigma, y nos sirve como punto de referencia el pubis y ver que tenemos una buena longitud del colon, que hay que movilizarlo bien. Inicialmente no sabíamos qué utilizar. Utilizamos el alexis, pero a veces en hombres con canal anal largo es muy difícil sacar el colon y no hay que forzar. Hay que vaselinar mucho. Esto lo pongo como ejemplo, esta parte de la técnica, que de hecho hemos decidido utilizar la bolsa, la funda de la laparoscopia, se recorta, ponemos el colon dentro, vamos a cerrar el vídeo, vaselinamos muchísimo y veréis que se extrae sin hacer tracción sobre el mesocolon y se evita cualquier lesión del colon. Vaselina no tiene que faltar, como el buen vino. Good wine. Okay. Y ahora sí, veréis, no torsionar y se saca la bolsa. Y voilà. El colon está fuera. Importante, cada vez más dejamos más corto, 8 centímetros, 6 centímetros el colon. Y después pasamos al último tiempo, que es con el paciente en posición ginecológica. En este caso es muy largo, ¿veis? Prefiero hacer un segmento más corto, pero pongo el vídeo. Y recientemente ponemos 2 puntos que marcan la altura del esfínter interno para parar en la disección, porque a veces hay pacientes con un meso muy grande, difícilmente disecas, igual te puedes poner dentro de la cavidad. También recientemente lo que preferimos es no hacer la anastomosis cortando poco a poco, sino quitar ya el colon protruyente, y si después necesitamos hacer otro donuts para que no haya una ectropion de la mucosa, lo hacemos a medida que se vaya haciendo la anastomosis. Una vez quitado esto, haremos la anastomosis colanal. No uso el Lone Star, yo creo que es más cómodo incluso 4 puntos de Vicryl, y con mucho cuidado y sin presión ponemos una valva de Sims. A veces es difícil encontrar porque hay cierta estenosis, y empezamos la anastomosis colanal, esfínter interno y cogiendo todo el espesor del colon. ¿Cómo se hace una anastomosis colanal? Damos los 4 puntos de referencia y 2 puntos por cada lado, por cada cuadrante. Very slow. Va lento este vídeo, no soy yo tan lento. It's not me, so slow. Ok, y completamos todo el... Y al final siempre revisar, y si hacen falta más puntos se dan para completar la cirugía. Yo creo que ya esto es todo igual y podemos pasar adelante. Para concluir, se puede evitar una ileostomía después de una resección anterior baja del recto por cáncer. Pero tenemos que tener claro que la seguridad, la eficacia de una cirugía se tiene que medir en términos de complicaciones postoperatorias, de calidad de vida y de resultados oncológicos. Esto es fundamental. Con lo que hemos visto en esta primera fase del estudio, la intervención de Turbo-QD puede considerarse como una técnica factible con resultados seguros y no aumenta la morbilidad postoperatoria. De acuerdo a nuestro protocolo, lo que sí necesitamos es esperar resultados a los 3 años para corroborar y para dar más fuerza a lo que creemos que esta intervención puede ser una alternativa para evitar la ileostomía de protección. Y probablemente aquí sale otra pregunta, si se puede también tener como alternativa en la colanal o colorectal ultra baja mecánica esta técnica. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Muchas gracias, Sebastiano, por este fantástico trabajo y enhorabuena por el premio, buscando siempre conseguir el mayor nivel de evidencia posible, como siempre hacéis. Y llegamos ya al final de este acto. Quiero agradecer una vez más al profesor Winter su presencia hoy aquí con nosotros, felicitar nuevamente a todos los premiados y emplazarles para el próximo año. Esperamos recuperar la fecha tradicional en el mes de mayo, como era antes de la pandemia, y también anunciarles que estamos trabajando para organizar un acto de homenaje al doctor Sánchez Ortega, quien fue jefe de servicio de cirugía de nuestro hospital y que también nos dejó el año pasado, y que esperamos también, en cuanto tengamos más información sobre cómo va a ser ese acto, esperamos que sea conjunto entre varios hospitales, y cuando sea la fecha pues ya se lo anunciaremos. Muchas gracias una vez más por estar aquí hoy.